Hello, friends and neighbors, and welcome back to the poem of the day for today, Sunday, September 7th, 2025. And before we begin, just a happy Sunday to everyone. I hope that today can be a restful and restorative day for you. I hope that wherever you are, it's beautiful outside and you get to spend some time outside. It's a bit chilly here this morning, which is kind of nice because it foretells again that the seasons are changing and that kind of more pleasant, crisper weather is on its way, if not here already. Although I think we're supposed to get a bit warmer later in the week. To kind of round out this week, where we focused a lot on poems about memory, relaxation, melancholy, nostalgia, fall, reasons to be resilient, reasons to reflect upon one's mortality, the cycle of nature, the changing of things. The poem we're going to work with today is called Just Autumn, and it's by a Polish poet named Zbigniew Herbert, who we have not read for the series yet. And Herbert was a 20th century Polish poet who is likened a lot to other modernist figures like T.S. Eliot or W.H. Auden, not just because of he came a little bit later than them, so it's not just as strictly he was influenced by reading their works, but he writes with a similar kind of moral urgency, intellectual rigor, a calling back to the classics, to the Romans and the Greeks. He was influenced by the Renaissance and Renaissance thinkers like Montaigne, and he has a very clear, blunt style, similar to what Williams was doing yesterday, William Carlos Williams, with the poem that we read. But instead of presenting specific images as a kind of eminent reality the way that Williams wanted to, Hebert was avoiding unadorned style and embellishment for the sake of avoiding sentimentality. And so his poems, I think, still have a strong emotional relevance, but because they're so clear and stark and unadorned. He lived through the Nazi occupation of Poland, the rise and fall of communism, the Solidarity movement. And so a lot of his work focuses on questions of what it means to live a meaningful life in a modern world and in a world of empire. And that's what's at work in this poem. This one is called Just Autumn, and it's from 1964. This autumn the trees have peace at last. They stand amid the solid, slightly contemptuous greenery, without a shade of yellow, without a grain of red in their leaves. The grass is thick, deeply rooted in the earth's skin, and it in no way reminds one of the fur of aging animals. Uncut roses revolve their warm planets around unmoving insects thin as moons. Only the monuments feel this autumn is more tragic for being the last. Decaying pedestals display the transience of the builders of empire. Angels' wings and admirals' crests are falling. The philosopher's cracked forehead reveals a terrifying void with burst blood vessels. Where the prophet's pointer finger used to be, there now floats a little spider hooked to the Indian summer. Gray-maned lovers walk under the eternal trees, along a path strewn with the brittle fingers of gods and emperors. Okay, I should have mentioned this before, but this poem is translated by Alyssa Vallis, and it's important to discuss the translator to give them credit with works in translation, especially, I think, poetry. We should read poetry that is translated that's outside of our language, but obviously there is something that will get lost in the translation because each language has a unique quality and characteristic that simply cannot be brought over in a one-to-one correspondence. But what is here in this Just Autumn by Hebert, you might have heard as I was reading that it sounded much more like a prosaic description than a poem. And we could talk much at length about what makes a poem as opposed to just sort of pretty prose. That's outside of the purview of the video today, but this is unstructured rhyme, unstructured verse. It's free verse poetry, and it's structured in 3 paragraphs. And so it gives us kind of 3 looks, 3 glimpses, 3 ideas of the scene that's being depicted. And what I think is interesting is the title is Just Autumn, which on first glance has a feeling of, oh, it's just autumn. After you read the poem and the, again, I think moral urgency or the severity that's depicted therein, it becomes just autumn. Like there's a justice that the autumn brings. And so the first the first paragraph is descriptive but not completely objective. Within the first line, the speaker is talking about the trees have peace at last. That there was something in the summer air that was turbulent, that was disturbing to them. And then the greenery, the grass around them, is gaining some contemptuousness, despite the fact that it's deeply rooted within the earth. I'm thinking the contemptuousness comes from it being more multitudinous, but also less fibrous and less strong and less fortified. The grass is beginning to change here, it seems, while the trees have not yet begun to have the yellow and red in their leaves. This line, I think, is really stunning, and it in no way reminds one of the fur of aging animals. And it's doing that sort of negative suggestion where it's saying the grass is not like this, but it's not telling us what the grass is like. And so through this negative association, it's placing within the reader's mind that the fur is like, or the grass is like the fur of the aging animals, which then makes earth itself or nature itself into this living, breathing, dynamic system like an animal is. And the last line of the first paragraph refers to the uncut roses revolving their warm planets around unmoving insects thin as moons, which reverses, I think, what we seem to observe in nature, which is that the flowers don't move and the insects buzz around them, almost orbitally. But also the comparison of the roses to planets further extends what Hebert is doing here to talk about nature as being more than just meets the eye. A rose is more than a rose as a planet. The grass is more than grass, it's the fur of an animal. And so there's a resonance that goes cosmically, that goes throughout the universe and back. The second paragraph here begins to focus on the monuments. So those things that don't occur naturally in nature, but those things that are adorning the park. And the monuments can feel the more tragic aspect of autumn. And it says, for being the last. Although I'm reading that as an insinuation of being their last autumn. And everything that's described in here is decaying, falling, cracking. He talks about the philosopher having these burst blood vessels, which is very interesting to me because I don't think of monuments as being alive until they erode. So they wouldn't have blood vessels to burst. They wouldn't have these live channels bringing lifeblood back and forth. But I think perhaps what's being suggested here is that with the year-to-year further erosion of these monuments, that they're becoming less sharp and less distinct and less noticeable and more covered up and sort of turned into a aspect of nature itself. And we see that at the end where the prophet's pointer finger used to be, there now floats a little spider hooked to the Indian summer. And I think it's interesting that Hebert chooses the pointer finger. You know, whenever I see decaying statues, it is typically the digits that go first. The details of the face wear off, but the things that fall off seem to be the fingers first. But to think of a prophet's pointer finger, it's somebody warning people and warning them about an oncoming cataclysm, an oncoming end, something sort of apocalyptic about it. But now that's been worn off. So there's no one to warn and there's no one to there's no direction to indicate some oncoming threat. And so a spider is just sort of hooked around there, weaving its own nest, making its own home there. And the last image we get is gray-maned lovers, so older folks, walking through the eternal trees along the path strewn with brittle fingers of gods and emperors. And as they're walking along, the trees are eternal. The trees die and come back, even though they haven't started to yellow yet. They have the peace of death that's coming for them because renewal comes later. But then the brittle fingers of the gods and emperors, the monuments, are all strewn there, almost like leaves, except that those are not things that grow and come back. So this poem seems to compare and contrast, seems to mash together the ways in which, decay is a part of the cyclical quality of nature, which for nature itself is something that is complete and affirming, but for man-made monuments, history, the historical political things, that those see an end and those come to a specific rest, decay, and irrelevance. Emperors pass away, but autumn doesn't, seems to be the thesis of the poem. So you could probably hear, as I mentioned in here, not just the historical political context that Hebert is interested in, but also the kind of intellectual vigor or moral urgency that he's putting into a poem. It's not just about autumn. That's all we have for today. Thank you again for joining us, and may peace be with you all.